I'm Dave Zirin, and welcome to ComcastSportsNet Celebrates Black History Month. Today's show is more than a celebration, though. It's an investigation aimed at answering the question, why? Why is the history of sports and the African American experience so deeply intertwined? This is a big question, and fortunately, we have people here capable of answering it. To my left, from Georgetown University, the Reverend Doctor himself, author, radio host, Michael Eric Dyson. Great to have you here, sir.
Great to be here, my friend.
And to my right in this corner, Kevin Blackistone from AOL Sports, from West Hyattsville, and a sports journalism professor at the University of Maryland.
Thank you for the invitation.
And our other guest is the only autograph that Kevin Blackistone has.
Absolutely.
A legend in these parts. 50 years ago, he desegregated the Washington Redskins when they were the last all-white team in the NFL. He doesn't need any introduction, but I'm going to make one anyway. Bobby Mitchell, great to have you here, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's our privilege, sincerely. So we'll start with you, Michael. Why do you think there is this tradition, this history, this connection between sports and the African American experience in the United States?
Well, I think, first of all, because the physical dimensions of black identity were stressed from the very first moment that black bodies deported from slave ships onto American soil. So we were bred to be bigger and faster and stronger, but for the purposes of serving Southern agrarian capitalism and slavery. We were trying to make this nation great. We literally built it from the soil to the concrete. So the physical dimensions of blackness were always focused on, and as a result of that, we invested in a very profound way our physical expressions as the poetry of our spirits. The body was the house for the poetry of the spirit. So we were finely attuned, and we paid attention to that. And then later on, when athletes, of course, were admired for their hulk and their strength and their brawn and their brutality when played on a sport that was within the context of American culture, then we became, those athletes became symbols. They were symbols of everything that black people wanted to be. Quick and fast and strong, and of course highly intelligent, and deeply and profoundly disciplined. So they are substitute arguments for what black people were denied in the broader society as well. We couldn't, get over segregation. Bobby Mitchell could desegregate, and when Bobby Mitchell desegregated the Washington Redskins, he did it for the rest of us. When Bob Gibson or Kurt Flood or some of the tremendous athletes who were on the cutting edge did this. When Joe Louis struck a blow against Max Schmeling, it was a blow for American democracy against a way of life, but it was also in behalf of African American people who had been excluded from American society. So they were ambassadors, along with entertainers. They were ambassadors for black excellence.
Wow. Now Kevin, you teach this to young people, coming into your classroom, probably knowing very little of the history that Michael Eric Dyson just described. Do you get the sense that your students who want to be sports writers get the political connection between the struggle against racism and the desire for athletic greatness?
Well, I think they're somewhat familiar with it. I mean, everyone knows the story, of course, of Jackie Robinson. His story's been told time and time again. It's become institutionalized now by Major League Baseball, so everyone's really familiar with that. I don't think, though, that students necessarily understand all the other stories that have gone along in sports and why it's so important. And one of the things I try and teach is that I think that sports has become, for black people, a prism through which other people see black folks in this country, as well as as a prism through which black people have seen themselves on a broader stage. And so back to what Reverend Dyson was saying, this has been a proving ground for us for so long.
Now, Bobby Mitchell, you live this. I mean, 50 years ago, you desegregated the Washington Redskins. I mean, looking back, what was it about that experience that you think people today may not know or appreciate?
Well, I think that people might not realize how hard it was. They hear us talk about it, and maybe sometimes we talk about it too much, because I did have one thing, and Rev was right. I don't remember ever lining up when I didn't think I was better than the other guy. I always thought there was something in me that would make me the winner, and I would come out on top. So when they said, why you run? Why you make so many long runs? Well, part of it I was scared. But the other part was I knew that I had this innate ability to walk out of it, and it was up here. It was up here. They never gave us credit for it, but it was up here.
Wow.
Everybody had the body, but I always had it here. Jim and I always talked about that.
You say Jim, you're talking about Jim Brown.
Jim Brown, yeah.
And you played with Jim Brown in Cleveland before coming to Washington, D.C. Jim Brown's certainly a giant, a Mount Rushmore figure in the intersection of sports and politics. What was the experience like being a teammate of Jim Brown, and how did that prepare you for desegregating the Washington football team?
You know, one thing about this is that I often said this. I'm so happy that I came through Cleveland with Jim Brown and Paul Brown. I don't think I would have made it in Washington initially if I had not. I'd been cultivated by Jim's thinking of being a strong black man. And because when I came to the Cleveland Browns, I was just a little scrawny kid out of Illinois and immature. And during those 4 years, I became a man. So it was easier for me to handle what I ran into when I got to the Washington Redskins.
I was recently researching the 50th anniversary of Bobby Mitchell's desegregation of the Redskins, and I had seen television specials about the history, but to see AP photos of the Ku Klux Klan marching on Griffith Stadium, the American Nazi Party marching on Griffith Stadium, you don't get that history to us today.
No, you
we
get
don't see
amnesia.
it. We get
you know
amnesia.
Why? We live in the United States of amnesia, as Gore Vidal said. And I add, the theme song is provided by Barbara Streisand. What's too painful to remember? We simply choose to forget. So we try to avoid dealing with it because it implies that something was wrong with us. So if something was wrong with us as America, then the arguments we've made about our superiority cannot stand. So we have to either be wrong or we have to be right, but to suggest that these people can't tell the truths that they embodied. And that's why we can't afford to tell the truth about the black men raising their fist in the Olympics, or George Foreman being hoisted up and celebrated because he waved the American flag. There were implicit and explicit ways in which America was not trying to hear what these black athletes, who were also great spokesmen and spokespeople for their race, had to say.
We got to go to break right now. Coming up next, LeBron James made his decision. The backlash was enormous. Did race play a factor? I mean, LeBron James certainly thinks so. What barriers and frontiers still exist for African Americans in the sports world? We're going to tackle that little subject when we return.
This is very tough. In this fall, I'm going to take my talents to South Beach.
What should I tell you?
I am not a role model. Hi, Chuck.
Seriously, what should I do?
Welcome back to Comcast Sportsnet Celebrates Black History Month. We have a hell of a panel right here. We have Reverend Dr. Michael Eric Dyson. We have Kevin Blackistone from both AOL Sports and the University of Maryland, and a local legend, Mr. Bobby Mitchell. I do want to start by talking about LeBron James, because let's sketch the story real quick, and we'll start with you, Kevin. Here's a gentleman who had one of the highest Q ratings. That means one of the highest popularity commercial ratings in all of sports. He goes from Cleveland to Miami. Now his popularity is one of the lowest in all of sports. He was asked about it by CNN.
Do you think there's a role that race plays in this?
I think so at times. It's always, you know, a race factor.
It's hard to discount race playing a part in it, obviously, because there were a great number of white fans, I think, in Cleveland who were disappointed with the way that he left the town. And I think more so, there were a lot of black folks who interpreted the backlash to LeBron's leaving, particularly from a white owner in Dan Gilbert, as being somewhat of seeing a white man exercise a white man's hegemony over another black man.
I think Jesse Jackson was right. It was almost like a runaway slave, what LeBron did, and Dan Gilbert's response. Bless his heart, he had a right to be pissed, but he can't be that upset. And that, you know, the conflagration was so horrible that you can't help but believe the race was a factor. And look what happened to LeBron. the moment he just briefly acknowledged that race was a factor, he didn't go on. One sentence in response to Soledad O'Brien, the nation rose up against him. He was taking it in stride. He didn't have to point out things that he knew was the case because he didn't want to exacerbate or make tense a situation. And quite frankly, you don't want to undercut your own economic floor. One way to get revenge, of course, against that very racism is to continue to receive white money. What's interesting, right? What's interesting on top of that, though, is that this was stunning to me. There could be legitimate disgruntlement with Mr. James for taking his talents and going to South Beach because you were a fan. Hey, that's not how Magic did it. That's not how Bird did it. You know, Jordan and all the gerontocracy came out. We wouldn't have done it that way. Well, you guys didn't do something that this generation can do. That is, say no to white owners in a certain way, thanks to Curt Flood, thanks to Spencer Haywood, thanks to a certain set of figures who paid the price. But you were operating in broad stroke on a plantation still, Mr. Jordan. You were underpaid for most of your career. You made money outside of the sport. You never complained, heroically so. You were stoic in the face of it, even got mad when Scottie Pippen dared balk at not getting enough money. You signed a contract, you do your duty. I love that about Jordan, but the reality is, Mr. Jordan, this is a different generation who says we're going to decide not by a conversation in the middle of the night, oh, by the way, you're traded. We're going to seize destiny and take it into our own hands. And I think that's a tricky thing for black men to exercise that kind of power. That's too much power for one black man to have.
And clearly, when we speak about people like LeBron James, when it comes to athletic superstardom, the sky is the limit for African-American athletes. But the front office is still a place which is very white relative to the number of African-American assistant general managers, African-American players, African-American scouts in all of the sports. You were one of the first assistant general managers. You were with the front office of the Washington football team for a very long time. And on several occasions, you were passed over for the top job. Did you feel that issues of race or racism played a role in that?
Well, it was very conflicting for the ownership. I knew how Edward Bennett Williams felt about me, and if it had been left entirely up to him, he would have done that. He would have made me the general manager. I always felt that Mr. Jack didn't want to be the first white owner to fire a black general manager. And because general managers get fired, all of them. And that's something you're facing, and I knew it was a little bother there. And so I accepted it in that vein, and I've lived with it that way, and very confident that we'd be further along if I had been the general manager.
I mean, why is there still so much farther to go on this question, Kevin? Why hasn't this question been answered by people like Ozzie Newsome and Reese with the New York Giants? Why does it still feel like a real issue?
Well, because I think it's American business. It's not something that's part and parcel of sports. I think when you look at American industry, I mean, I think that's the story. It's been the change has been extremely slow to come.
And that's a great cue for us to go to break right now, because coming up next, we've been talking about the relationship between the African American community and sports. The question we're going to talk about in the next segment is this a relationship in need of therapy, or perhaps even in need of a divorce? A lot of people think so. We're going to ask our panelists right after this.
We need to teach our kids that it's not just the winner of the Super Bowl who deserves to be celebrated, but the winner of the science fair.
That was Barack Obama at the State of the Union address saying, don't celebrate the Super Bowl, celebrate the science fair. And you hear this critique a lot from a segment of the African American leadership in this country, saying there's too much emphasis on sports, too much emphasis on materialism, hip hop. And you wrote a book called Is Bill Cosby Right, or Has the Black Middle Class Lost Its Mind? And so I ask you, with that as a jumping off point, what do you think of what Barack Obama said?
Well, I think he said that because the Bears are not in the Super Bowl. He's a rabid sports fan, and so that's a bit of self-criticism that we could use. There's no question about that. I just think people are a bit off when they don't recognize. If I wasn't in the rap game, I probably have a key knee deep in the crack game, Biggie says. you know, either you got a jump shot or you got a wicked, you know, either you sling and crack rock or you got a wicked jump shot. So there are many more options than that. But a lot of people think sports, entertainment, and the like provide easy avenues of escape from unfair and unjust economic conditions.
When I came along, you grasped anything you could to move ahead. And I grasped what was thrown at me. My desire was it was dentistry. I expected to be a dentist. But I started scoring touchdowns and people had other ideas and I went in that direction. Fortunately, because of sports, that's why I can't attack it in any manner, my son was able to go to Sidwell Friends, Stanford University, Georgetown Law. Obviously, I couldn't have done any of those things. So the sport, and my daughter was able to go to my university and then to Harvard grad. But that's sports money. So I don't, you get it any way you can get it. I think that if we take what is available to us, then more kids will graduate from high school. I'm disturbed by the number of kids who do not graduate from high school. And it's all because what is thrown out there to them is, you got to go to college. Well, no. What he has to do is graduate from high school. If I can get people to understand that, because if he goes to high school, the chance of him going to college is very, very good. But if the ball is out there at college, never get there. He stops on the street.
Kevin Blackistone, you grew up in West Hyattsville, you still live in the area. How do you compare and contrast when you were growing up about the connection between sports and the African American community? Are we in a better place now than we were?
It's no question it's greater now. The things that have happened in the 70s and the 80s and into the 90s, sports is a much bigger part of Washington life than I think ever has been, and I think also has had a positive impact. I mean, whether you look at Abe Poland's investment in downtown Washington, D.C., which has helped revive that, whether you look at the number of black players who have come through here and actually done things in the community. And it's not only pro sports. You know, you got to look at the things that John Thompson did at Georgetown when he moved from St. Anthony's as a legendary high school coach to coaching at Georgetown, and what that meant for black kids who got an opportunity to go there, who beforehand may not have been able to avail themselves of that education.
You know, growing up in New York in the 80s, I thought Georgetown was a historically black college. Seriously, as a little kid who was a St. John's fanatic and seeing the teams play, I thought Georgetown was an HBCU. I did. I just did. We're going to wrap up our celebration of Black History Month right after this, and when we return, I'm going to ask these three fine gentlemen who, from the history of African American sports, they would like to sit down with to pick their brain. We'll be right back. We're back to wrap up Comcast Sportsnet Celebrates Black History Month, and I wanted to end with a question. We're going to go around the horn, if you will, and I'm going to start with you, Kevin. And I want to
trademark.
Yes. I want to ask you this question: if you could have dinner with one person in the history of sports, particularly connected to the African American experience in sports, you have 1 hour to pick their brain. I'll even pick up the tab. Who would it be? Well, who would you like to sit down with for an hour?
I only have one person who meets that dinner date, and that would be Paul Robeson. He's a hero of mine. His narrative is remarkable. He was great at everything that he did. He was a legendary All-American football player at Rutgers, 1918, 1919, I believe. Went on to law school, played professional football, was a great actor, a great orator, a great singer. His political beliefs in terms of freedom in this country and fighting for it were a standard at the time that I don't think any athlete has reached today. And the fact that this country at one point celebrated him as one of its greatest Americans, and another point thought of him as such a threat that it blackmailed him in this country, took him off of the All-America team. Because he was no longer seen as an All-American, despite the fact that he was fighting for freedom in this country. And then obviously eventually came back here, and the way he was celebrated around the world.
I have talked to the man I would choose, but I would talk to him at a different stage in his life, and that would be Muhammad Ali. I got a chance to be one of 8 scholars to present on Mr. Ali in the early 90s, and he was there. And I saw him in an airport a year later, and I was with my wife, and I said, he'll never remember me. And he walks up to me, he says, "You that Negro that can talk."
That's Ali.
And my wife said, "Oh, you know him well." But I would have loved to have spoken to him when he was capable of more speech, and at an earlier period in his life, when he was able to talk about how he was deeply and profoundly reviled. I did speak to him. I said, "You made a mistake when you spoke out against Malcolm." He said, "Yes, I did." The courage, the bravery, and the fortitude to stand up and to defy what America was to make it better, I think I would choose Muhammad Ali.
Wow, Bobby Mitchell.
You know, I was so fortunate as a youngster in the South because I had some good summers with the likes of Roy Campanella, Don Newcomb, Joe Black, Monty Irvin.
Wow.
And I'd like to revisit those days, and I'd like to sit with Roy because obviously along the way I forgot some of the things he said because I have a lot of questions for him now. And I would have loved to have been able to do that. And again, I want to thank him for buying my graduation suit my senior year in high school.
Wow.
Wow.
That's wild,
Well,
for real.
I'm very tempted to say that mine would be Bobby Mitchell after today. Just an amazing person. But I am going to say mine is Wyoming Attias. She was a sprinter in 1968, won the gold on the
Tennessee
relay.
State.
Yes, sir.
Wanted to be a part of the African American revolt. Athletic revolt, and women were not allowed to be a part of that. And John Carlos has told me that's his great regret. And after she won her gold, she said, "We dedicate this to Tommy Smith and John Carlos." So I'd love to sit down with Wyoming Attias. Well, we got to go. This has been an amazing event. Kevin Blackistone, thank you so much for being here. Michael Eric Dyson.
Thank you, sir.
Bobby Mitchell, an absolute honor, sir. I'm Dave Zirin for Comcast Sportsnet. Thank you for joining us.